Hey everyone, it's Austin here, back with another video for Human Ideals. This is going to be a three-part mini-series on my attempt to incorporate spiritual ideas into the field of communication. As someone who used to be a communication major, now transitioning to an interdisciplinary program called Narrative Multimedia Activism, I'm really passionate about the role of identity politics in creating systemic discrimination and the possibilities that may entail towards creating large-scale cultural reform. Now, for me personally, I'm not particularly left-leaning, so this series is going to take a more bipartisan, non-conventional approach, as will all topics concerning human ideals. So anyway, what is this particular essay going to be about? This first essay was written 2 semesters ago in my fall class called Com 206, Communication and Culture. It's basically, like I said, this class was about the role of identity politics in topics such as, the role of culture in creating hegemonic atmospheres, the role of marginalized identities such as disabled people, the role of intersectionality in our political discourse. There were lots of topics like mass reproduction and popular culture, subcultures, branding, spectatorship, and lots of discussions around whiteness and masculinity, emotion, appropriation, free speech, war, the role of body image in female oppression and whatnot. So very leftist, liberal topics. Now, what was kind of difficult about that class was before entering that class, I was and still am. I was a fan of conservative talk show hosts like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson, and I still really like their take on these issues because they're heavily opposed to anything relating to identity politics and leftist discourse, and which is why this inspired me to take a more bipartisan approach around these issues, and having a spiritual background that really gave me an advantage in writing these essays and taking a higher perspective on these topics. Now, this first essay I'm going to be sharing in this series is titled Counter-Hegemony as a Unifying Culture of Perfection. It's basically a debate as to whether we can create a counter-hegemonic atmosphere without creating an oppressive ideological state apparatus in doing so. Now, I'll explain what that term ideological state apparatus means in this essay, but basically, I'm tackling this topic from the Buddhist perspective of no self, and this concept was illustrated in an interview done by Jim Carrey in 2017 on the red carpet. I'll go into that later, but for now, I hope you guys enjoy my take on this topic of hegemony and counter-hegemonic cultures. Ideology is often regarded as a force that obfuscates the accurate perception of reality. This notion assumes that accurate perception is more valid than ideological perception. Louis Althusser affirms this assumption in his work Lenin and Philosophy and Other Essays, stating that ideology represents the imaginary conditions of individuals to their real conditions of existence. Through his conception of ideological state apparatuses, non-state institutions that impose collective beliefs, norms, and values upon their members, ideology is also depicted as a form of hegemony. These institutions would include churches, schools, families, and so forth. It is hegemonic in the way these institutions exert power upon their members and obtain unconscious consent. With that said, Antonio Gramsci believed in the counter-hegemonic potential of philosophical inquiry due to the challenging of common sense. Since hegemony is reinforced by culture, the works and practices of intellectual and especially artistic activity, counter-hegemony is often reduced to the resistance of institutional ideology. However, the class division behind this so-called common sense notion may be challenged through the communication of culture as, quote, the pursuit of perfection by Matthew Arnold. It can be argued that counter-hegemony is, instead, the pursuit of higher cultural ideals, an effort that not only deconstructs the notion of common sense, but one that challenges the perception of high culture as an inherently classist institution. A contemporary example in which this view of counter-hegemony can be applied is the interview of Jim Carrey in September of 2017. This interview went viral due to the socially abnormal responses that Carrey gave to the interviewer. Rather than answering the interviewer's questions on his personal life, he gave a jarring comment on his existential view of having no self, while mocking the Hollywood culture of celebrating icons. Quote, "I wanted to find the most meaningless thing that I could come to and join, and here I am. Who's Jim Carrey? Oh, he doesn't exist, actually. There's just a relative manifestation of consciousness appearing. And then somebody gave him a bunch of ideas. They gave him a name, and a religion, and a nationality, and he clustered those together into something that's supposed to be a personality, and it doesn't actually exist." End quote. Based on this comment, it can be assumed that Carey himself was resisting the hegemony of his cultural industry while engaging in the so-called pursuit of perfection or self-perfection through philosophical inquiry. This may also be an allusion towards the inherent class division between the icons that are being celebrated and the consumers of said cultural industry. Yet, Carey's mocking of the Hollywood industry reveals his lack of faith in the possibility of counter-hegemony being antithetical to class division. Carey's critique of the ideology of self relates to Althusser's concept of interpolation. It is the way in which ideology reinforces the identity of individuals as self-referential subjects of ideology through their social interactions. Quote, "You and I are always already subjects, and as such constantly practice the rituals of ideological recognition, which guarantee for us that we are indeed concrete, individual, and naturally irreplaceable subjects." In this case, the ritual of ideological recognition is the interaction between Hollywood icons and the public. This reinforces the identity of both parties as being subjects of the ideology of self through the practice of celebrating icons. As such, the hegemony of the Hollywood ideological state apparatus gives rise to a counter-hegemony founded on the resistance of interpolation, the view of no self. Carey also conveys the notion of Hollywood promoting the message of celebrating icons to control the public. Quote, "Communication is a process whereby messages are distributed in space for the control of distance and people." End quote. Gramsci, however, notes that such counter-hegemonic movements are susceptible to becoming yet another ideology. They are seen as an intermediary stage in becoming truly independent from hegemony and interpolation. Quote, "Consciousness of being part of a particular hegemonic force is the first stage towards a further self-consciousness in which theory and practice will finally be one, whose elementary and primitive phase is to be found in the sense of being different and apart, and an instinctive feeling of independence, and which progresses to the level of real possession of a single and coherent conception of the world." End quote. This emphasis on the importance of merging theory and practice beyond a mere, quote, "feeling of independence" is, perhaps, what is lacking in Carey's execution of counter-hegemony. Although he may be a subject of the theory or ideology of no self, the practice of mocking Hollywood culture reinforces the class distinction in high culture. This interpolates his very self as a subject under hegemony rather than achieving the exact opposite. The dilemma of creating a single and coherent practice of counter-hegemony is acknowledged in Matthew Arnold's conception of high culture. He addresses the root cause behind the perception of high culture as a classist ideological state apparatus. Quote, "The disparagers of culture make its motive curiosity. Sometimes, indeed, they make its motive mere exclusiveness and vanity. It is valued either out of sheer vanity and ignorance, or else as an engine of social and class distinction, separating its holder like a badge or a title from other people who have not got it." End quote. Arnold argues for what he views as the proper incentive behind counter-hegemony. Quote, "The first motive which ought to impel us to study is the desire to augment the excellence of our nature and to render an intelligent being yet more intelligent." End quote. He implies that high culture can be a counter-hegemonic force because it challenges the association of class distinction with counter-hegemony under the proper incentive. In Carey's feeling of pseudo-independence from interpolation, Arnold suggests that while he had the desire to see things as they are, he overlooked, quote, "the love of our neighbor, the impulses towards action, help, and beneficence, the desire for stopping human error, clearing human confusion, and diminishing the sum of human misery." End quote. The rift between theory and practice conceived by Gramsci caused Carey to not realize the unifying function of counter-hegemonic culture. Gramsci frames the incentive of Jim Carrey to partake in the ideology of no self as the desire for a kind of status, a lone rebel with his own hegemonic high culture. Yet this is the very distinction that Gramsci suggests is a rudimentary understanding of counter-hegemony. While he emphasizes the fact that philosophical inquiry transcends both religion and common sense, Gramsci does illustrate the strength of religions in their cohesiveness. Quote, "The strength of religions, and of the Catholic Church in particular, lies in the fact that they feel very strongly the need for the doctrinal unity of the whole mass to ensure that the higher intellectual stratum does not get separated from the lower." End quote. Ironically, because Carey interpolated himself into his own ideology by mocking the celebration of icons, he overlooked the religious foundation of the no-self teaching. To use a personal example, the religion of Buddhism teaches the three marks of existence as being impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and no-self. While Carey seemingly embodied the teaching of no-self, his unconscious adherence to class distinction made him devalue the cohesiveness of his ideological background. While it can be argued that Carey's self-interpolation caused this devaluation, and Buddhists may argue that this hegemonically reinforced his sense of self, Matthew Arnold proposes a reason that coincides with the sincerity of Carey's realization. He argues instead that the fear of Hollywood abusing its power as an ideological state apparatus is what pushed Carey towards a divisive, counter-hegemonic interaction. Matthew Arnold conceives of a unifying cultural ideal that he calls the state. Although it may generally be perceived as a governmental institution, Arnold envisions it in a more communal context. Quote, "What if we try to rise above the idea of class to the idea of the whole community, the state, and to find our center of light and authority there?" End quote. This emphasizes the lack of class distinction between the state and the people advocating for the state, thus deconstructing the notion of it being a typically hegemonic ideological state apparatus. To support this ideal, Arnold also sympathizes with Carey's unconscious fears, understanding that, quote, "We are all afraid of giving to the state too much power, because we only conceive of the state as something equivalent to the class and occupation, and are afraid of that class abusing power to its own purposes." End quote. Based on his dismissal of pursuing such ideals out of vanity and ignorance, Arnold opposes high cultures founded on hegemonic incentives without denying the existence of such institutions. This leads to a solution in creating a unifying counter-hegemonic high culture, the development of our best self. This bears striking similarities to Gramsci's conception of philosophical inquiry, perhaps due to the transcendence of both religion and common sense. Even though subjects of the state consent to its creation and exertion of power, which can be framed as a form of interpolation, Arnold believes in the self-regulating intelligence of these subjects. Rather than being blinded by his unifying high culture, Arnold stresses the necessity of transforming our unconscious selfishness in order to achieve this ideal. He makes a clear distinction between our best self and our lower self. Quote, "This is the very self which culture or the study of perfection seeks to develop in us, at the expense of our old, untransformed self, taking pleasure only in doing what it likes or is used to do, and exposing us to the risk of clashing with everyone else who is doing the same." End quote. He argues that through the conscious development of our psyche, the risk of consenting to a hegemonic perversion of the state becomes a non-issue. Quote, "But by our best self we are united, impersonal, at harmony. We are in no peril from giving authority to this, because it is the truest friend we all of us can have, and when anarchy is a danger to us, to this authority we may turn with sure trust." End quote. Through the deconstruction of high culture as a hegemonic ideological state apparatus, counter-hegemony is recontextualized as a unifying process. This definition of counter-hegemony seems counterintuitive due to the prevailing common sense of class struggle. Jim Carrey's embodiment of the no-self ideology demonstrates how the interpolation of subjects perpetuates class distinction even when the ideologies they consent to are rooted in counter-hegemonic incentives. This is further compounded by the lack of philosophical inquiry Gramsci proposes directed towards self-examination. However, this does not deny the potential abuse of power by such ideological state apparatuses. Rather, it demonstrates the necessity of deconstructing the class distinction within hegemonic institutions as well as within one's own counter-hegemonic motives. Because Jim Carrey overlooked the purpose of counter-hegemony as promoting the prosperity of all classes, he became the subject of an ideology interpolating himself as an intellectual, and the participants in the Hollywood industry, both celebrity icons and consumers alike, as simpletons, to use Gramsci's argument for religious cohesiveness. To resist this tendency is, according to Matthew Arnold, to rise above our fear of the state. The state is not to be conceived as another hegemonic institution, or even a governmental institution. Rather, it is reborn as a communal, self-regulating movement towards psychological sovereignty. To truly realize this ideal high culture, both external interpolation and self-interpolation, as Jim Carrey has done, must be overcome through the development of our best self, that which transcends the common sense class distinction in both self and no-self ideologies.
Hey, Jim Carrey. Yes.
What?
I've covered a lot of fashion weeks. This is the first time I've run into Jim Carrey. Wait, tell me, is it true you're wandering the streets? You need a date to the party? What's up?
No. I'm doing just fine. I just, there's no meaning to any of this. So I wanted to find the most meaningless thing that I could come to and join, and here I am.
They're celebrating.
You got to admit it's completely meaningless.
Well, they say they're celebrating icons inside.
Celebrating
Do you believe
icons,
in
boy, that is just the absolute lowest aiming, possibility that we could come up with. It's like icons. Do you believe in icons? I don't believe in personalities. I don't believe that you exist, but there is a wonderful fragrance in the air.
You don't believe certain icons have the power to make change, to think differently, to be bold, to inspire others? Artistry? You're one of them.
On the good foot. Ha! Yeah. You shut it down now. Yeah, no, I don't believe in icons. I don't believe in personalities. I believe that peace lies beyond personality, beyond invention and disguise, beyond the red S that you wear on your chest that makes bullets bounce off. I believe that it's deeper than that. I believe we're a field of energy dancing for itself. And I don't care.
But Jim, you got really dressed up for the occasion. You look good.
No, I didn't
Was that an
get dressed
accident?
up. I didn't get dressed up.
Who did?
There is no me.
There's no you.
No.
We're not here. This is a dream?
There's just things happening. And there are clusters of tetrahedrons moving around together.
Okay.
Yes.
So what's happening in our world right now? Because there is a lot of news that actually is relevant that's not that
Here's
uplifting.
the thing. It's not our world.
None
That's
of this
the
is
key.
real?
Nope.
So you're just passing
We don't
through.
matter. We don't matter.
Oh, wow.
There's the good news.